Hello, and welcome back to E.G. the Virgo for An Unusual Kind, That 1%. Based on actual experiences and theories, this story includes entertaining fictional and non-fictional images, animation, videos, and music by artists and photographers unrelated and in no way were created for this particular story. Some names, dates, and times were changed to protect the privacy and identities of the characters within the story. And this is still part of Volume 1. One Life, Five Generations. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on past this disclaimer here for copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for the fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. This source is from Circular 92, Copyright Law of the U.S., 17 U.S.C., Section 107. And now, let's get right into our next chapter. Chapter 8, The Phone. E was a very busy, adventurous little 8-year-old with a vivid imagination. Sometimes E's imagination was so vivid, she could make others think her imaginative projections were real, or make others question themselves. It would tickle E to death when others weren't sure if E was joking or not. Others' reactions to E's projected imagination would make E laugh so hard she would sometimes have trouble catching her breath while she was still laughing. E also had a talent of making all sorts of different sounds with her mouth and voice. These were sounds most people couldn't make with their own mouths or would have to be taught how to make some of the sounds E could make. Sometimes E could make the sounds appear to be coming from a different area or direction other than from herself, which would really confuse people as to where the sounds were coming from. More like a ventriloquist would or who could throw their voice. That's the part E loved the most because sometimes she enjoyed just sitting and watching others walk and look around for where sounds may be coming from, not realizing the sounds were coming from E, who would be right in front of them the entire time, making the sounds from her mouth, voice, and throat. One day, while home with her mother, brother, and sisters, who were all sitting at the kitchen table having fun discussions of different subjects, E mischievously decided this would be a good time to prank her family with one of her most imaginative projected sounds and actions. While everyone else was busy talking at the table, E quietly put her head face down into her arms, which were resting on top of the table. Knowing no one was paying any attention to her at the time, E began making the perfect and well-timed imitation sound of the constant ringing of their house phone, with rolling her tongue and using her throat to send the sound through her tongue. Everyone was sitting at the kitchen table immediately stopped talking. raised up and began turning their heads in different directions of where they thought they heard a telephone ringing. It also acted, or shall I say, E also acted as though she heard a phone ringing too. Well, everyone knew the ringing of the phone they heard was slightly different from the sound of their actual house phone, but they all could clearly hear a phone was ringing from somewhere inside their house. E's oldest sister got up from the table and went over to the kitchen phone, mounted on the wall, and lifted the receiver to see if she would possibly be able to hear something coming from the house phone. But she would quickly find out it was no one on the house phone, and it wasn't their house phone ringing. While they were all still confused about the sound of a ringing phone, E made the sound of a ringing telephone again as she was still sitting at the table, again with her head face down into her arms, which were still resting on the table. E was having an extremely hard time trying to keep herself from laughing out loud at her family's reactions and expressions. E's mother said she knew there was no other working phone in the house, so where could the sound possibly be coming from? E's brother said, maybe it's our neighbor's phone and they have their window open and their phone turned up on loud or something. But E's mother quickly debunked that idea by stating their houses wasn't connected to any other houses, and the houses were too far apart from one another, and none of their closest neighbors' windows were open for them to be able to hear anyone else's phones ringing. E could hardly continue containing herself from laughing because at this point, the whole family is walking around the entire house waiting to hear a phone ring again so they could see where it was coming from. E felt this was just too good of a prank to just let it stop at a ringing phone. So she ran over to her toy phone that she left on the coffee table in their living room and yelled out, I found the phone that was ringing. Everyone rushed to the living room where E was standing in front of the coffee table with her phone on it. And while E, or shall I say while everyone was still entering the living room to see what E was talking about, E held her head down with her back facing her family and made the ringing sound 2 more times before she lifted the toy receiver, which, or shall we say the telephone toy receiver, which was an old house phone E's mother let her have to play with because they didn't use that phone anymore. E then put the phone receiver up to her ear and said, hello, just as she would have if she was answering a real phone. The family looked in amazement and in disbelief at the same time of how good of a trick E had played on all of them, until E began talking on her play phone as if there really was someone actually on the other line responding back to E's questions and comments. E began asking the secret imaginary caller their name, and then repeated a name the secret imaginary caller supposedly said. With a straight and concerned expression, E told her family, who were all still standing around her in the living room, the caller said, They wanted to speak with someone named Eli. However, everyone knew it couldn't have possibly been that phone or anyone talking on it because the phone wasn't connected to anything for it to work. E then continued by telling her family that the caller said their name was Miss Elsie. Miss Elsie Patton. Everyone began telling E the trick was over, but E continued talking on the phone. E said the caller said to everyone talking in the background that she could hear them and that she was not a trick. And who did we think we were calling her a trick? E's second oldest sister laughed and said, because the caller was a trick. Then E's facial expression changed to looking seriously confused and told her mother the caller sounded mad. E's mother and siblings looked at E in disbelief and laughed while E was still holding the phone receiver in her hand, looking at her family with a serious facial expression. E then, as convincing as she could possibly be, repeated herself and said she was serious and wasn't playing. There is actually someone on the other line. E then put the phone slightly back up to her ear as if she heard the caller still talking. E then very respectfully said, "Excuse me, miss, but my mom said you must have the wrong number because there is no one named Eli here." E's siblings began telling E she was being simple while they were still laughing. While the phone was still up to E's ear, E told her siblings the caller said everyone will see how funny things are when she comes to our house. E then began looking very concerned and said the caller was yelling in her ear. E's brother advised E to hang up the phone. So, after E's brother advised E to hang up the phone on the caller, which E did so, everyone, including E, returned to the kitchen table, laughing and talking about how good E's trick was. But then the phone rang one time again. Everyone looked back towards the living room where the phone was, and then looked at E, who was also sitting, talking and laughing with them the whole time at the kitchen table. So they thought and said it couldn't have been E this time. But E's mother's expression showed she still wasn't quite buying into the whole idea of the phone ringing on its own. However, she did know E was sitting right at the kitchen table with them and was talking and laughing with everyone else when the phone rang again after E hung up her play phone and went back to the kitchen with everyone else. E then excitedly said to her family, "I told y'all somebody was really on that phone," even though E knew within her heart no one was really on her play phone. E then looked at her mother with a serious face and asked her in front of her siblings what they were going to do when that lady got to their house. E's brother interceded and told E to stop playing because there was no lady on that phone. The phone doesn't work and no lady was coming to the house. E's brother then continued and told E she was only scaring herself and no one else. E then asked her brother in an argumentative tone how the phone rang by itself just now. E's brother had no answer and just looked at E. 10 minutes later, as everyone resumed discussions at the kitchen table and E's mother began preparing to fix dinner, someone actually knocked at their front door. E and all her siblings immediately looked at their mother, who turned away from the stove and looked back at them in wonder. No one budged from the table, not even E, who was also in real shock. E began worrying and wondering slightly to herself just how real her prank and imaginary caller had become. E's mother cautiously and curiously walked to the front door to see who was knocking, as E and her siblings all stood back in the kitchen doorway watching their mother walk to the front door and to see who was knocking. Before saying anything, E's mother peeped out the living room window, which was next to the front door, to see if she could first see who was knocking. As E's mother looked out the window, E quietly asked her mother who it was. E's mother replied she didn't know, but it was some lady. E's siblings looked at her because E had just told them that the imaginary lady said she was coming over to their house. E's brother then asked E in disbelief if someone was really on that phone. E's second older sister said E did sound like she was really talking to someone on the phone, but they thought E was joking and didn't think some strange lady would actually come to their house because the phone wasn't connected to anything and it didn't work, which is why E's mother let E have the old phone to play with. E looked at her siblings in just as much shock and fear as they were, because E knew it was just supposed to have been a joke the entire time. However, it appears it may have come to fruition. After discussing E's phone call among each other, they all turned their attention back to their mother at the front door, who was asking the person knocking who they were. The person answered and said her name was Elizabeth and that she was aware no one in their home knew her, but she wanted to know if she could use their telephone to call a tow truck and call someone she knew for her to get a ride back home because her car just so happened to break down in front of their house. Once E and her siblings heard the strange lady on the other side of the front door say her name and asked to use their telephone only about 15 minutes after E's little phone prank, E's siblings actually asked E how she knew some strange lady would be coming to their house with a name similar to the one of the fake names E used in her prank phone call. And in a serious but concerned voice tone, E told them she didn't know anything like that would actually happen. E's brother said, yeah, because you said the caller asked for someone named Eli, which is the first three letters in that strange lady's name who had just knocked at their front door. They all, again, turned their attention back to their mother, who is bringing one of their other real house phones that was also located in the living room on a small bookshelf to the front door with a strange lady named Elizabeth to use to call for help for her car and get a ride back home. E's mother cracked open the front door just enough to get the phone through the door and get a good look at the lady's face, and then handed the phone, or shall we say, handed the lady the telephone for her to use. After Elizabeth used the phone, she said thank you very much to E's mother, and that she really appreciated her allowing her to use the phone to call for help. Then Elizabeth walked back to her car, which was sitting in front of E's house, and waited inside of it for the tow truck to come and for someone to pick her up to take her home after the tow truck towed her car away. E's mother was still in deep thought about how everything unfolded, almost the way E said it would on her prank phone call. Even the fact that what the lady wanted involved the use of a telephone, which they were all just laughing and talking about E's telephone prank only 15 minutes before the lady named Elizabeth actually arrived and knocked on their front door, hoping to use their phone to call for help for her car and to get a ride home. In addition to all that, the fact that the play phone rang once more by itself. Also, E and her family realized that the caller on E's prank call, she said that the person said her name was Miss Elsie, the first name. This lady's name was Elizabeth. So we have E pretending to be a ventriloquist and throw her voice. The person on the phone was Eli, the pretend phone. And E thought it was funny. She made the fake ringing sound until, well, did the phone ring by itself? Because the house phone didn't ring. And where did that one more ring come from? And then we had somebody who actually showed up to their house named Elizabeth, with the first three letters being ELI for Eli, which is also what she said on the phone when she said the person said their name was Eli when she was playing a prank. And the person also said, well, they said they was looking for someone named Eli, but their name that on a prank call was supposed to have been Miss Elsie, still beginning with the letter E, E-L. Okay, so, and that's when all the fear set in and the confusion set in, and then a real phone was needed when the lady came and she called for a tow truck. So when you put all this together, do you still think things are just a coincidence? How a simple prank and trick manifested itself in real life, and how it shocked the prankster, which was E in this case here, just as much as it shocked her family. So E pretty much had instant karma, where she was pranking her family with pretending like The phone was ringing. Somebody was talking on the phone. Somebody said they were coming over, and somebody actually did show up to the house, even though she was just pretending that she was talking to someone and that they were going to come over to the house. It wasn't nobody, none of that was supposed to happen because it was all a prank, all a joke. But then somebody really came up to the house, and it really was a lady whose name was Elizabeth, and whose name, had the first three letters of the person that E pretended had called the house looking for an Eli. And the lady's name was Elizabeth, the real lady. And the person on a caller, E said the person's name was Miss Elsie Peterson or Patterson. And that began with the EL as well. And the fact that it was a lady that she pretended that was on the phone. And a lady actually showed up. So, again, the things that make you think, the unusual kind, that 1%. Now, was it just a coincidence? Or did E unknowingly demonstrate, discover, or unleash an ability or gift that she had or has and not realize it? That's something we have to keep in mind. Not everything is coincidental. And remember, E was just 8 years old. And until next time, people, for chapter 9, which will be Rex. That's the name of the chapter, Rex. And we're going to try to get that one together. It took us a while to get this one out and put it together for you all, so I hope you enjoyed it. So until the next time, I hope you all have a blessed life. Thank you for tuning in, and I will be talking to you later.